When I read the essay, The Crisis of Expertise, that Professor Slack wrote, I said, we have to get this woman here. She speaks to what many of us feel about the assault on our intellectual framework, the basis upon which our civilization sits. The essay is among a number of 1,000-word essays done by tech faculty. A reference to these essays will be in the next digest. And interestingly enough, I just found there's a new book out with the same title, The Crisis of Expertise. So it's probably a growing concern throughout the country. This is a most timely topic. Our speaker, Professor Slack, will talk about the crisis of expertise and the impact on the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Slack?
Okay, hello. First, I want to thank you very much, Horst, for inviting me, and thank you all for the opportunity to be present and give a presentation at this forum. It's delightful. I know so many of you already, and it's nice to see some new faces in this moment of isolation. It's interesting how the pandemic, in making travel difficult, has opened up new possibilities for communicating. I've found lots of new friends, both globally and locally. Having been closed off from sort of the normal modes of travel, academic travel, and communication. But isn't that how it always is? Adversity opens up opportunities to see the world differently, to see our problems and challenges with fresh eyes, and to design new paths forward. That's how I try to see the pandemic. Don't worry though, I'm not going to go down the path of claiming that the pandemic is some kind of gift. It's not, it's a nightmare. And it's been handled so badly in the United States. So I want to get that out on the table as my position to begin with, that I think the pandemic has been a disaster. But the moment this pandemic has the capacity to contribute to teaching us a lot of things that we really do need to learn. I want to start by suggesting that the pandemic is not a singular crisis. It's not just a medical or a health crisis, although I think a lot of people still look at it that way, that this is a medical crisis, a health crisis. Instead, I see it as a crisis with many legs. It's certainly a crisis of the economy, and this pandemic has revealed how much the economy is in fact in crisis. It's also a crisis of politics, and here we are in the midst of a very, very difficult political moment that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. It's a crisis of education. I can't begin to tell you how much we have learned about the weaknesses in our educational system in the moment of this pandemic. It's a crisis of faith in who we believe, who we trust. It's a crisis of knowledge, what's true, what's not true. How do we know what's true? How do we know what's not true? Of trust, who do we trust in the midst of all of this? How do we base our decisions on who we trust? And it's also a crisis of expertise. And it's the crisis of expertise that I want to talk to you about today. As a student of communication and culture, I've been following this crisis of expertise since the development of social media, long before the pandemic. But the crisis has been rendered particularly potent in the moment of the pandemic. So for a long time, I've been variously fascinated and horrified, as perhaps you have been, by the spread of misinformation and disinformation over the internet. I started out actually by studying Wikipedia. And when Wikipedia was being developed, there was enormous amounts of misinformation circulating on Wikipedia. And I was trying to understand this new format of people making the news and making the encyclopedia. I was horrified once when I came across a entry in Wikipedia that said, and it's kind of a timely moment, that it was safe to drink bleach. And I monitored how long it took to take that post down. So I've been tracking this issue of expertise and tracking changes in answers to a few questions. Who is an expert? Who deserves to be listened to? Who are the experts we should trust? So I have been asking, along with many others, and perhaps you, why all of a sudden does it seem like people are believing outrageous things that simply aren't true? And why are all of these outrageous things being spoken by people as if they were experts, but clearly aren't? At least I don't consider them to be experts. So are there any experts anymore? How do we designate? How do we understand where expertise is, where the boundaries are between who is an expert and who is not? There's a whole lot to unpack in those questions, but it's useful to recognize that they also involve a cluster of terms and concepts that get tangled up with one another. So expertise relates to questions of trust. Do you trust the experts? It involves questions of knowledge and knowledge production. Who produces useful knowledge and how is it produced? What counts as fact, and do facts matter, and how do facts matter? And the role of values and beliefs in the determination of who you trust, who are the experts, and what facts matter, and if in fact there is such a thing as facts. So it's very, very complex problem, actually, and it's ultimately impossible to disconnect expertise, trust, knowledge production, fact, values, and beliefs. But I look at that array of issues and questions through the lens of expertise. And I think that's really important right now because currently the problem is especially salient with respect to COVID-19. Lots of people are perplexed and asking, why are so many people ignoring the virologists, the epidemiologists, and other scientifically based advice about responding to COVID-19? Why are there so many conflicts about who the experts are? Why are people resisting the knowledge of experts? And why are people believing what is essentially nonsense? I was driving in this morning and listening to the radio, and someone was they were talking about COVID. There was a discussion between a couple of people, and one man said that in response to a question about COVID-19, he said, it's a virus. There's nothing to be done. It is what it is. And I was just astounded that at this point in time, you could say that there's nothing to be done. And it's that kind of position that I find really mystifying. But I want to offer an example that illustrates many aspects of these issues. And I've gone to Fox News for this one. So this is Tucker Carlson. In May 2020, Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson dismissed the advice of physician and immunologist Anthony Fauci, a member of the coronavirus task force, and probably someone with whom you are all familiar. And he dismissed his advice when Fauci warned us how to and how not to open the economy in light of the pandemic. And of course, we are now opening the economy in contradistinction to all of Fauci's advice. You'll remember that Fauci cautioned against opening without appropriate measures in place. Specifically, he told us that it was fine to open if we had sufficient testing in place, contact tracing, near universal use of masks, and adherence to social distancing practices. So when he made that statement in May, on his program, Tucker Carlson vehemently objected to Fauci's advice and asked, and I'm sure that this is a rhetorical ask, how does he know this exactly? Is Tony Fauci right about the science? Do we have any particular reason to think he's right? In his own assessment of the situation, Carlson pointed out that there were other doctors who hold other views. But I note that he didn't bother to name those doctors or those other views. Instead, he explicitly denigrated Fauci's status as an expert. He called Fauci silly, a buffoon, someone who is apt to say some stupid things. Carlson actually called Fauci a bad scientist. And in a further challenge to Fauci's expertise, Carlson added, this guy may be way more off base than your average epidemiologist. Beyond the personal condemnation of Fauci as an expert, Carlson challenged the very place of scientific expertise in the decision to open the economy or not. He accused Fauci of having too much power and asserted that no appointed doctor should make the call on what our federal policy is. We elect leaders for that because we are supposed to be in charge because it is a democracy. So there are several different positions on expertise buried in Carlson's diatribe. So each of them deserves a look and kind of separating out or parsing out the pieces of his argument. And I know that Tucker Carlson is way out there, but it is true that the things that he says and he said in that are echoed throughout our culture. So it's a convenient summary of a lot of positions that are out there with enormous impact. So first, there's a challenge to specific claims to expertise. The question is Fauci a worthy expert? According to Carlson, he isn't. He is instead a bad scientist. And who gets to decide that? Now, this is an important question that I'm going to return to. But clearly at this point, Carlson thinks he has the right to decide. So he can make that determination. He is somehow qualified to make the determination that Fauci is a bad scientist. So second, there's a challenge based on comparative expertise. So not just specific claims to expertise, but comparative expertise. Well, this is what we do when we weigh the quality of one person's expertise over another. Like when you choose a physician to treat you, you pick perhaps one over the other because you believe one is a better doctor. In other words, the question is, whose expertise is better? So according to Carlson, Fauci may be an expert, but others' expertise is better. Specifically in this, he claimed that this guy may be off base more than your average epidemiologist. So the average epidemiologist is better than Fauci. And unnamed other doctors are also better than Fauci. So these two challenges, the first and second challenges to expertise, are based on the internal qualities of the individual expert, as if expertise is something that resides within a person. So the first is based on the status of the individual expert, And the second is based on the relative or comparative merits of one's expertise. A third challenge to expertise is based on the application of expertise on one's actions rather than on their character. Here the charge is that a person's expertise in one area should not be applied in another area. In other words, stay in your own lane. This is critical in the pandemic because here Carlson asserts, and I'll remind you, no appointed doctor should make the call on what our federal policy is. We elect leaders for that because we are supposed to be in charge, because it is a democracy. In other words, the scientists should work over there and the politicians should work over here and stay in your own lane. This implies, interestingly, that the pandemic is a political problem, not a medical problem. In the case of Fauci, I find this accusation astounding because Fauci has so assiduously, and in my mind, maddeningly, avoided political statements and positions, tried to. But clearly, for many people, Fauci is viewed as taking political positions, no matter how careful he tries to be. And there's no shortage of irony here, because if the pandemic is political, a political problem, not a medical problem, surely anyone's political position, even Fauci's, has a right to be heard. And Fauci was appointed to the coronavirus task force, so his voice on a political level should be sufficient. So what's happening here, I think, is that Carlson seems to be treating science as a special case. He seems to be insisting that science has no special right to be heard in the political arena. That's rather huge, actually. The assumption that science has no special right to be heard in the political arena. I'm going to return again to that problem because this points to the very real impossibility of separating regulatory science from politics. And I'll give you a little preview. I'm going to argue that that is impossible, that it's impossible to separate regulatory science from politics. For now, however, notice that none of these three positions is a challenge to expertise in general. Some people may be bad experts, but expertise is still valued. Some experts might be better than others, but expertise is still valued. There are those other doctors out there, presumably they are still valued. Some experts might need to restrict where they apply their expertise, and certain forms of expertise should be kept separate from one another. Notably, science should be kept strictly bounded and apart from politics, but expertise itself seems to remain valued if exercised in the proper bounded forms. So there's a fourth challenge to expertise that runs through this moment that challenges expertise in general. And it's characterized by a complete lack of faith in the very idea of expertise. And this is the kind of reaction against expertise that I've been tracking for some time. This problem is a little bit more difficult to explain because it always occurs alongside the kinds of specific challenges that occur in real historical moments like the COVID moment. So it will help if I take a brief historical detour here. What I'm calling the crisis of expertise is not new. It's just currently heightened. And it's heightened, it's a resistance in this moment as a resistance to let me start that again. In this particular moment, there's resistance to expertise in general that is extreme. And some of this comes from this long exposure to the internet and social media. This is what Carlson relies on to give him the right to challenge Fauci and Fauci's expertise. It's an implicit assertion that his knowledge is every bit as valid as Fauci's. In a sense, what happens here is the field of knowledge becomes flattened. Everyone's knowledge is equal, making expertise irrelevant, because expertise is something rare. It's a designation that not everybody knows this, the experts know this. So expertise is sort of by definition rare. And if everybody knows the same thing, if everyone has the same information, if everyone has the same knowledge, then there is no such thing as expertise. There's just common knowledge. So if you think about it, we don't even need the term expertise until there's a crisis that demands a term to explain a crisis. So let me say that again. We don't even need the term expertise until there's a crisis that demands a term to explain the crisis. So look at it this way. Without the concept of expertise, people just go on doing what they do, right? They heal people, they fix the plumbing, they attend to the electrical system. They just do what they do. We don't need to designate what they do with special status expert. That is, unless and until there's a problem, a perceived crisis that demands maybe calling someone out or some group out for doing something badly, or that demands comparing someone or some group's work to another. So, for example, comparing the work when we shifted in the United States from largely homeopathic medicine to allopathic medicine, there was a need to develop the notion of the medical doctor as expert, to separate the homeopathic medicine as illegitimate and allopathic medicine as legitimate. So you develop this notion of allopathic medicine, MDs as experts. And therefore you can compare the two. It's also the case that, that you may have a perceived crisis that demands siloing one's area of work from another's. So for example, if I'm an insurance company, I need to silo the expertise of MDs, homeopaths, osteopaths, chiropractors, right? So you, again, stay in your own lane. Some of these I will support as an insurance, I will pay for the insurance coverage for these, some of these I won't. So that produces the need to identify certain people as experts, certify them as qualified. The reasons for these demands change. I've just given you a couple of examples, but the reason for these demands or the demand to establish expertise changes given particular political, economic, cultural problems, issues, and challenges. And so history is full of these moments. These are not new problems. The use of the terms expert and expertise go back to the 1850s and the 1880s, respectively, which suggests a long history of such challenges. So if you want to read more about that history, I suggest, and Horst, I think, was mentioning this book, this is a new and really amazing book called The Crisis of Expertise by Gil Eol. And he goes back even further and looks at the 1800s in some detail. It's really a fascinating and wonderful read. And it's helped me develop my understanding of the nature of the current crisis. In place of the long history that he tells, I think the current moment of crisis must at least acknowledge some of what happened after World War II. So I have personal knowledge of that moment. I remember the 1950s as the beginning of a time when the promise of science ran powerfully through the politics and everyday life. We were raised this way. Science was going to bring us all a better life. It was a powerful message. There was enormous trust there's that word trust. There was enormous trust in the scientific process to do so. I felt that deeply. Space exploration, medicine, healthcare, food safety, transportation, computerization, even in exercise science. I remember being taught exercises in high school that were approved by the government as scientifically appropriate and would assure a healthy citizenry. All of these, space exploration, medicine, healthcare, exercise, food safety, transportation, computerization, and on, all of these were elevated by politics to near reverential status. This was science being elevated by politics to near reverential status. A visit to Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry was requisite for almost all K through 12 students in Northern Illinois. And it set the tone for my understanding and my generation's understanding of what science was going to do for us. All of this scientific and I remember walking on the moving sidewalk, which was a level escalator, that they were going to be everywhere and all the sidewalks were going to be these moving escalators. Now, actually, we only find them in airports, but that was the story that was told. All this scientific and engineering work was going to realize the realities of the sought for good life. And what I want you to notice about this is essentially a political project. This necessarily breaks down separations between politics and science, between the expertise of doing politics and the expertise of doing pure science. Regulatory science becomes the name of the game. So you can correctly say then that politics embraced science. As Eol puts it, politics was scientized. And I think that is a huge insight to grab onto and understand the significance of that. It's because it's a crucial precursor to the accompanying trade-off, which is that we must now negotiate that science is politicized. You cannot scientize politics without politicizing science. So I want to make that, show you how that works. So many of you here are scientists, and all of you know, or at least familiar with enough about science, that I probably don't need to say much about it, other than to remind you that there is no single science and no universal agreement in the scientific community over time about much of anything. I mean, I've been astounded in my lifetime, having been raised that science teaches this, and I'm always unlearning what I learned as a kid to learn what science now knows. I remember being astonished when I learned the atom wasn't what I was told the atom was when I was a kid. And having to shift what I believed was a fixed truth. So there's no single science. There's no universal agreement about much of anything. There's momentary agreement, but not universal agreement over time. So science develops based on uncertainty in terms of continued exploration of what is not known, not in terms of what is known, but what is not known and what is not understood. So science gets things wrong. That's how it advances. But once science is interlaced with politics, scientific assessments are open to political scrutiny. They have to be. Science is then violated, polluted, and impure, necessarily. Ironically, that is what makes it precisely useful. It's not useful, it's not regulatory science until it is in conversation with politics. So the very openness of politics to science leads to public pressure, interest groups, input and challenges from different interest groups, seeking to use science in one way or another, positively, negatively, correctly, incorrectly, because the public and politicians are generally not experts in science. So it isn't surprising that there are tensions between the public and scientific expertise. So even as regulatory science struggles to find ways to constructively incorporate the non-scientist public in its deliberations, there is a fundamental mismatch between the slow work of science and the expediency of politics. For example, it's entertaining, sad, and more than a little bit frightening to watch members of Congress try to grapple with the realities of matters like how the internet and social media works. I don't know if you've watched any of those hearings, but they're really disconcerting. Similarly, it's a little bit frightening to see members of Congress deal with the intricacies of climate change. And it's really disconcerting to see how our government is dealing with how pandemics unfold. This mismatch, however, is virtually inevitable. The tension is as frustrating as it is necessary. It can be managed, but it is not solvable. And I was really convinced by that by reading Eol's book, that it is not solvable. I kept waiting for him to say, well, here is how we can solve this tension. But it is the tension that makes science useful. But what I want to do now is throw into this mix, this sort of chaotic moment, the matter of media. Because at this moment in time, media have made enormous and contradictory contributions to mixing up the status of expertise. So before new media and internet, experts had ways of regulating their own or bestowing and revoking qualifications. So experts, as noted correctly by Carlson, aren't elected by popular vote, and for very good reasons. Rather, expertise is attained in discipline-specific ways designed by previously designated experts with the goal of maintaining the integrity of different skill sets. So experts are grown, they're cultivated by other experts in processes of self-governance and self-regulation. For example, this is done by awarding college degrees with required curricula, issuing certifications, requiring apprenticeship, ongoing education, and instituting forms of censure. All these work to preserve expertise and promote trust. You can think about apprenticeship programming, apprenticeship programs in for electricians and plumbers. You can think about graduate students having to learn to teach as a graduate student assistant. You can think of internships for doctors. I mean, there's all these complex processes that are used to assure the continuation of high, respectable expert standards. So scientific regulation has built-in processes designed to move knowledge forward. So not just reproduce old knowledge, but to move knowledge forward, correct errors, and offer the best assessments of what is true and what is not. So the whole scientific method is designed to do that. So scientists are never always right, and knowledge changes. But recognizing that is the source of the informed skepticism integral to the disciplinary oversight of the scientific process. So when someone like Fauci offers advice based on science, he does so with decades of knowledge cultivated and recognized as worthy of being taken seriously. I think I saw something yesterday that he was just awarded the best governmental employee. It was just something on Twitter. I don't know if it's accurate, but he's received lots and lots of accolades and lots of certifications and sort of passed many tests to justify the label expert. However, and very interestingly, these forms of regulation that I've laid out here, or these forms of regulation of expertise operate from within the club, so to speak. So these are self-regulating structures. It's like a club. You can think of it as a good club, but it's like a club. And they may preserve expertise and promote trust, but they also create walls around themselves to protect those inside. And inside tends to be resistant to change, often deaf to the voices and concerns of excluded people, often silent on the biased effects of funding and sponsorship. And they often serve as cover for enormous violations of the public trust. And I think about some of the current debates over police unions is a really good example of this. While you might view a police union as designed to preserve and protect and promote good policing, it also tends to be resistant to change in policing structures and strategies, clearly often deaf to the voices and concerns of excluded people, minorities in particular, often silent on the biased effects of funding and sponsorship, so who pays their salary and how much they're paid and who they answer to. And police unions have, in fact, often served as cover for enormous violations of the public trust. I mean, this is what's given rise to this whole external movement talking about defunding or revisioning the police. And so that's an example of one of these sort of clubs meant to regulate expertise internally, sort of getting into trouble precisely because of the inward-looking protective nature of that group. So science as a real practice, and I'm not talking here about it as an ideal, but as a real practice, is hardly innocent either. As history demonstrates, once public trust is broken, even slightly, it can break down dramatically. When public trust is broken, the effect is that it can sideline what's good. So I think you can see how the police unions are having this problem right now, right? There's been so much outcry about police unions and policing that the good policing is really sidelined, and no one really focuses on that or knows how to focus on that constructively. So with regard to science, you can pick your moment of broken trust. There's a lot to choose from. You can go back and look at the safety of radioactivity, I remember when I was a child watching a video about the safety of radioactive materials. And I'll never forget, etched into my brain is a swimming pool and women lined up in bathing suits, walking down the steps across the pool of I don't know what it was, radioactive water, and then walking up the other side. And so you say, they're alive, they're wonderful, radioactivity is safe. It took a long time for us to realize that wasn't true. You can look at the research conducted on human bodies without their knowledge. The HeLa stem cell, for example, the violation of prisoners, minorities by the medical profession. You can look at the lies of the tobacco industry. And more recently, you can look at the anti-vaxxing movement as an example of moments of broken trust and how once the cat is out of the bag and the general public learns that science is flawed, there's no stopping the avalanche of suspicion and mistrust. It's interesting. Trust is very difficult to gain and very easy to lose. And I think the image of the avalanche is really appropriate here. And the anti-vax movement illustrates that pretty well, because there was one flawed article that set the avalanche off. And as soon as people began to fear or believe that vaccinations caused autism based, as I said, on a flawed article, not even good science, that just avalanched. And it was very difficult to counter that. And that got spread to other areas of medicine and science as well. And we're seeing a lot of the fallout from that actually in the understanding of COVID-19. So into that enter new media and the internet that can very easily spread information, good information and bad information, misinformation and disinformation. It provides easy access to information that often looks expert and looks professional and mirrors exactly what we've seen before, but is often a problem for us. So at the same time that the media encourage healthy skepticism, it also feeds mistrust. Fox News, anonymous social media posts, bots operating from undisclosed locations, politically motivated broadcasts, films, videos, documentaries, podcasts, articles, and books that are all proliferating, feed the resistance to expertise and often drown out legitimate voices. So it's the case that science takes place largely quietly, but the abuse of science and misinformation and disinformation tends to be loud and widespread, drowning out more reasonable voices. So mistrust of science is currently and unsurprisingly rampant, to the point that the very notion of expertise itself has been challenged. So there's a TED Talk out there in which a self-proclaimed expert on experts tells her audience not to trust experts. It's astonishing to watch. So it's a tirade against expertise that argues for the leveling of knowledge, that your knowledge is as valuable as Fauci's. So don't listen to the experts, but listen to me, she says. She said, I'm aware of the irony. I am an expert on experts. But that's how serious this problem has become. Tom Nichols, in his 2017 book called The Death of Expertise, goes so far as to claim that the United States is now a country obsessed with the worship of its own ignorance. And we're proud of not knowing things. We've become a country obsessed with the worship of our own ignorance. And we're proud of not knowing things. While healthy skepticism of experts is warranted and part of the normal scientific process, as well as integral to the tension between experts and politics, I think that Nichol fears that we have gone too far. So let me say that again. Healthy skepticism of experts is certainly warranted and part of the normal scientific process, and integral to the tensions between experts and politics. But Nichol claims we've gone too far. He claims we now actively resent them, with many people assuming that experts are wrong simply by being experts. And I think you can see some of that in Carlson. I think you can see some of that in Donald Trump. I think you can see some of that in Trumpism and an awful lot of that in contemporary politics. I think Nichols is wrong to go quite that far. And I want to pull you back now to recalling that in the first three challenges to expertise that we saw operating in Tucker Carlson's diatribe, what we saw lurking in the corners was actually a trust of expertise. So we haven't given up on expertise entirely. I think Eol, once again, is right when he claims that expertise is one of the key words of our time. But it's not because it doesn't matter. It's precisely because it matters so much. So I ask you to call up in your mind the image of Donald Trump's doctors. I thought about sharing this image with you, but I thought you've all seen this image. Remember the image of Donald Trump's doctors in their white coats, their mat, all lined up behind the podium? That was a show of expertise. We weren't introduced to them. They were just standing there in formation, the experts who were taking care of Donald Trump to assure us that his care was of the highest quality and that we should believe that he was healthy. Now there's the irony. This is the president who rebuffs his coronavirus experts, like Fauci, and he puts his doctors on a display of expertise to advance his political agenda. That's what we're seeing. So we're seeing expertise marshaled for particular political purposes. We can learn from moments like this what controversies over expertise always teach us. There is no simple formula for how expertise functions. There are only complex connections of multiple factors that intersect at particular moments. There's marshaling expertise at particular moments in particular ways for particular political, economic, social, cultural ends. At this moment in time, I think it's fair to surmise that a generalized mistrust of experts circulates in relationship to, but does not supplant, the other concerns about expertise. Instead, we live in a moment where we need to address, I think, the following in relationship to one another. First, there is a propensity to mistrust individual scientists. That seems pretty easy to pull off. Secondly, there's a loyalty to certain experts over others, which is not determined solely by traditional forms of internal regulation, but by a range of cultural, political, and media influences. So I think the loyalty to certain experts over others is largely driven outside of those regulatory boundaries, those internal regulatory boundaries, but by the work of politics, media, and this shifting cultural ideology. Thirdly, there's a sense that politics pervades science, and can therefore be used or ignored selectively in line with one's politics. I think it's pretty widely accepted that science has been politicized, and there's a general awareness that science has been politicized. Therefore, it becomes very easy, in line with the other forms of mistrust and challenges, to just disregard what science doesn't agree with what you are already committed to in terms of your own beliefs and values. And fourthly, there's this generalized mistrust of expertise whenever it fails to conform with what you already believe and value. The interesting thing is, you can't counter this by insisting on respect for expertise. Because once you insist on respect for expertise, you're doing it from within some kind of internal position of expertise. That's that self-regulating function. And it works to insist on erecting barriers to that version of expertise from the public, and then it becomes useless. So you become siloed off. So you can't just simply insist on respect. That only feeds the mistrust. Why should I believe you? So I would be remiss if I didn't offer something like a positive direction out of this crisis. And I think there is one. I think there is a way forward. It's not fast, and certainly not fast enough to address some of the pressing problems we face, like climate change, and certainly this pandemic, which is evolving so quickly. I think, first of all, we need to recognize the necessity of the tension between politics and expertise. The necessity of the tension. We need to learn to find ways to work in that space of tension, not deny it, not say it doesn't exist, it shouldn't exist, because it has to exist. It's the nature of regulative science. Without that tension, there's no hope for change. We need to think in terms of crisis as productive. And I know that's kind of frustrating, but I think it's something we have to accept. Second, we need, and this is a much more specific suggestion, we need to commit to better forms of what's been called science communication. I'll give you an example of a problem. You can't just say, as Anthony Fauci did the other day, in response to a question about the White House super spreading event, the facts speak for themselves. So he was asked, what was the problem with that? And he said, the facts speak for themselves. Now, this is Fauci trying to keep science separate from politics. I understand why he said it, but it doesn't work, because one person's facts are another person's political gambit. You may not want to believe this, but that is the unavoidable political and cultural reality. And I see calls all over from scientists and academics, trust the facts. These are the facts. Believe in the facts. But people aren't listening. People need to be able to understand why it might have been legitimate in February to say that people didn't need to wear masks. But by March, it was clearly not the case, and we were told to wear masks. So in the popular culture, people are saying this is evidence of science's failure. And Fauci is often brought up because Fauci said you didn't need to wear masks. It The change wasn't in response to an error, but it is how science develops. And people need to understand that. The hard work of teaching how science works needs to be a fundamental part of basic education. Now, I mean something different here than teaching biology or chemistry, but teaching and studying science, how it works, how it's evolved, and that it invites controversy. So I envision something like a cultural studies or a mix of cultural studies, psychology, philosophy, anthropology in science that brings experts in science and brings experts in culture into co-equal conversations. Not serving one another, but bringing into being new ways of working, learning, and teaching. I really wish I could have a conversation with Dr. Fauci about what he's missing by not understanding that he is fundamentally political and helping him find ways to communicate that better traverse the politics and the science. But even further, I envision science and something like cultural studies joining forces as co-equal partners in structures and projects to develop a fully realized form of what Eol calls trans science. Now, I don't like the term trans science. I'd call it something with a more co-equal name, which hasn't been invented yet. The problem with trans science is it places science in the center, and then science would get help from communication scholars, cultural scholars, social scientists, et cetera. And yet I'm proposing something different, a co-equal joining together of a project that deals with science and all those other humanistic communication, cultural components. So participation in these projects would work together to address issues like pandemics, climate change, health, healthcare, and so on. These are not issues of pure science. They are every bit as much political and cultural problems as they are scientific ones. This is a vision for something beyond one group supporting another. It's beyond collaboration. The situation, I believe, demands that we do something more. We need to find new ways to do the actual work together, to become, in a sense, very different kinds of experts. So I welcome your thoughts, questions, suggestions, input of any kind. Thank you.